seated.
Hello. So, welcome. It's amazing to be here. My name is Colin Phillips, but you probably knew that. And I have the privilege of spending the next hour or so telling you about things that I care about and people that I care about. And I'm just really happy to be here. And I am also just incredibly happy that you are all here. What I hope to do is give you a sense of what I do and why I enjoy it and why I'm excited to be here. And that includes the fact that we're doing this here in Somerville College. And I hope you'll come away with an understanding of who is here and why they really matter to me. Okay, so this is a really broad audience, and that's exciting. It's also a little intimidating. It not only ranges from the Vice Chancellor to my parents, who are somewhere around here. It also ranges from people who are worried that I'm going to go over their heads, and people who know the material much better than I do, so they're worried that I'll embarrass them. So we'll do the best we can. So I want to start with a picture. And we're going to see this picture a few times. It features Rosalie, who is one of the people who traveled the furthest to be here today. She took an overnight flight from the US yesterday. And so that's, if she falls asleep, that's why. I like this picture a lot for all kinds of reasons. And if you can understand why I like it, then this talk will have been a success, because what we're going to do is unpack what's behind this. Okay, so this is from 2 years ago. It's a big event called Maryland Day, where the University of Maryland opened its doors to about 60,000 people, where you've got everything from musical performances, to standing inside a wind tunnel, to putting your hand inside a cow's stomach, to talking to language nerds like us. And in this picture, Rosa is trying out a new game that we were working on for collecting spoken language data from kids, and you get to play it yourselves. The game is called Race the Robot. It's basically the gamification of a speedy closed paradigm, and you're going to get C sentence fragments and have to come up with a word that completes them. Kids are pretty familiar with the idea of looking for things in Google these days, and they even know autocomplete. Times have changed. So the computer is good at completing sentences, and humans are pretty good at it too. So if you see, like, Princess Anna is from, hopefully you'll come with something like Arendelle if you're of the right age to have seen Frozen 100 times. I had to look it up. So we're going to give it a try. So be sure to call out so that we can all hear. Okay. So this is the instructions that you would see if you're doing this. So let's practice and see if the robot agrees with your guesses. Okay. Ready? So. Awesome, great. That's called a very high closed context, so you all agree. Fantastic. Okay, so let's try again. So now do another one. Yeah, teeth, you got it right. Okay, do another one. Ready? So this is what Google will come up with. So do another one. Ready? Pay close attention. So this is actually what Google comes up with, or did already go with. That's kind of weird. So language models, they're still working on it. And so we get to do one more. See if you can do better this time. You didn't do very well there. Okay, this is the be that the girl. You guys are really cautious. Like, you didn't even need to measure the reaction time there. You could use an hourglass to measure. My God. Okay, so you got the basic idea. So this one was difficult. A decent continuation might have been something like swatted or noticed or heard. I thought some of you might have come up with stung, but you were ready to be tricked, right? So you were on guard. But the fact that you were so slow, who was tempted to say stung? You guys are also honest. Fantastic. Right, we're going to get on great. So you got to experience the conflict, and if you were a participant in this study, then we use that as a basis for a follow-up conversation with you at an age-appropriate level. but you signed up for a whole lecture. So you get an hour of me explaining the whole context to it. And background, why we care, why we're doing speech recordings in a less than pristine lab setting, and how any of this might be relevant to Oxford. So sorry, but that's what you signed up for. So what we're going to be talking about here is a bunch of different intersecting timelines. I know that some of you are here to hear about the research, some of you are here for the stories and the personal bits, and some of you are here for the after party. I get it, and I hope there'll be something here for everyone. But so I want to talk about 4 things, and they're organized in terms of different WH questions. These are things that linguists really care about. I taught teaching a whole seminar on that this term, that we were doing it this morning. So first, what's going on? I want to explain why it's a really interesting time to be a psycholinguist. And here we're looking at a scale of maybe 60 years. Second, why do I care? I want to explain a little bit about what's really motivating me and how I got here. There we're again talking about 30-year timeline. Third, a lot of what I'm talking about is research that explores language through the lens of different fields. So I want to talk about what I've learned over the years about how to create thriving interdisciplinary environments. And again, we're talking about a 30-year timeline. And finally, I want to say a bit about the local context. So why is it an exciting time to be doing language here in Oxford? And why am I excited to be here doing these things? And of course, as with everything around here, this fits with a slightly longer timeline, which we'll have to cover in less detail. So to get started, let's look at what's happening in my field of psycholinguistics. And the hot take here, there's a hot take for each of the 4 pieces. The hot take is it feels like the 70s again, and that's a good thing. Okay? So what do I mean by that? So let's start by looking at some ways in which languages vary. So some kinds of variation are pretty obvious. English verbs come before their objects, and in Japanese, so you say Harry ate the pizza, but in Japanese verbs come after their objects, and you say Harry pizza ate. At the level of sounds, it's pretty easy to see that, say, English distinguishes the vowels in ship and sheep, while Spanish doesn't, and that's also easy to tell. And if you learn Russian, one thing you quickly figure out is that Russian verb roots are specified for aspects, so that means that you need a whole different verb root for every verb you know, depending on whether the action is completed or not, and that's super fun. And English doesn't do that, and we can come up with a million things like this, okay? But this is not the kind of thing that keeps linguists up at night. A big development in the field dates back to the 1950s and 1960s, when ideas from the emerging field of computer science were imported into linguistics, leading to what were called generative grammars. And this sounds a bit scary, but basically it just means nothing more than trying to write code, or generally pseudocode, that generates all and only the possible senses of a language. And what happened when people tried to spell things out so explicitly is, surprising things happened, is that they started turning up all kinds of different regularities that they'd been totally unaware of before, even in languages that we thought we knew lots about, like English. So I could show you hundreds of different examples, but you didn't sign up for a whole seminar. So I'll just highlight one of my favorites from this. This is something that's systematic between languages, but it also varies. Okay? So let's take this. So if we take this is involving ways in which you interpret pronouns. So you see if you get this. So if you have a sentence like, while John was reading the book, he ate an apple. So John and he, they're the same person, right? There's no problem with that. Right, so let's add a bit more. We can flip the order of the pronoun in the name. It's not so common, but it still works. While he was reading a book, John ate an apple. He is still John. Okay, right? Now we can flip the clauses. So John ate an apple while he was reading a book. Okay, still John and he, they're the same guy. And now we'll flip the pronoun in the name again. He ate an apple while John was reading the book. No longer the same guy, right? Yeah, so it's quite a systematic regularity. Works, it's true in almost all languages. And people were unaware of it until about 50, 60 years ago when they started to build explicit models of trying to do this. And so, interesting also, so this one that you find impossible is impossible in basically every language you look at. This one is pretty good in most languages, but it's not good in Russian. And that's something which is actually a more recent discovery, because I remember exactly when it was discovered. I had a Russian, Nina Kazanina, when she was a student in my class in Delaware 25 years ago, she was sitting in the back seat pulling a face, and that was the moment when that generalization was discovered. There's a whole line of interesting work came from that. Okay, so as linguists started discovering these new generalizations, they quickly started to make sense of why they exist. Do the generalizations fall under higher level generalizations? Linguists also really took seriously their cognitive consequences. They assumed that these generalizations reflect some kind of tacit knowledge. And they worried about how it is that children come to converge and agree on these things. For generalizations that are hard to observe, those were the things that we actually worry most about, like the one we just saw. The options were basically that you either build it in, or that somehow this is linked to some other trait of the language that is easy to observe, and you learn it from that. And in the subsequent decades, there have been many, many more discoveries. But the basic outlines of the problem are the ones that people would still find familiar if they came from the 1970s to today. And most of this early work was happening at a high level of analysis, figuring out what makes possible and impossible sentences, but without considerations of how things happen in real time, how information is stored and accessed in memory, and how it's neurally implemented. That was just out of reach if you go back 50 years. That's stuff for the finer grain of analysis, which was really only in its infancy at the time. But things are different now, and it's that finer grain of analysis where I spend most of my life. Okay? So we can get into what we do with this by using some analogies from vision. So vision scientists have learned a huge amount about how the visual system works from studying visual illusions. So if you look at these two pictures of the Tower of Pisa, they look like they're different, even though you believe, because I'm putting this here, that they're actually identical. They look like they're different and they're diverging. And you can do that with other towers that you care to find. It actually works better with this one. That's exactly the same picture, but it doesn't look like it. So things get even more interesting when you figure out how to turn illusions on and off. So I don't know if this will work from the distance you're at. Can you see the scintillating grid effect here? We've got nods at least at the back, so it's working. And then, does it go away when we make the lines wavy? Yeah. So that's gold dust for people trying to understand these things, because if you can turn it on and off and figure out what's responsible for that, then that helps you to narrow down on the mechanisms that are responsible. So that thing that I just explained to you in 30 seconds, that's basically what we do. And it's more complicated the way we do it. Okay. But when you lose the track, it's basically that we're going to be spending the next few minutes on. Okay, so that's what we've been doing a lot of in recent years. So we can start with maybe the simplest and most widely studied case of a linguistic illusion involving subject-verb agreement. So in a sentence like, the key to the cells, unsurprisingly, were rusty, the auxiliary verb should be was agreeing with a singular key, but if you stick a plural noun in there, then in a position that should be irrelevant, people often incorrectly produce a plural verb, or if you present it in comprehension, people often fail to notice the error. It happens all the time. And this is often called agreement attraction, because the verb is attracted to agree with the irrelevant noun. This is not a new discovery. So in fact, the author Anthony Trollope in the 19th century was aware of this, so he commented that a singular nominative will be disgraced by a plural verb, because other pluralities have intervened and tempted the ear into plural tendencies. Which is not the way we would put it now, but he got the idea. So it's been around for a long time, but by now we know way more about what's going on in these cases. So we know more about where agreement attraction occurs and where it doesn't occur. So it's sometimes called proximity concord, but that's actually not true, because sometimes the plural that does disruption, it can be further away. So it doesn't have to be closer. It's sometimes often reported that plurals create illusions whereas singulars don't. That's a little more contested, but that'll do for now. And importantly, it seems to be a one-sided effect. What I mean is, attraction can make bad sentences seem good, but the opposite doesn't happen. If you have a sentence like this one, the key to the cells unsurprisingly was rusty, which is good, the plural doesn't make it seem bad. So it only goes one way. And this is something that this grammatical asymmetry is something that we discovered by accident when we were trying to do something else. And it turns out to be actually quite important for understanding what are the causes of why people mess up. So one popular way of thinking about agreement illusions is to think that basically people just store stuff wrongly in memory. So maybe you remember the keys of the cabinets incorrectly, and maybe you mistakenly think that the plural goes with key rather than with cabinet. But if that was the case, then you would get the symmetrical effect. The good ones would seem bad, the bad ones would seem good, it would just always flip. And that doesn't seem to be true. An alternative is that it's not an issue of how you store the information, but how you go about accessing the information when you need to formulate that subject-verb agreement relation. And so, in grammatic, what you do when you encounter a plural verb like are is you go looking for something that is plural and a subject. Well, in the bad sentences, or in the good sentences, you'll find what you need and you're fine, and everything is okay. In the bad sentences that cause the problem, nothing matches, but sometimes you get partial matches, and if you add some noise to that, then that could be enough to get you to sometimes mistakenly think that it's okay. Okay? So the grammatical asymmetry, this turned out to be actually a very useful way of distinguishing different mechanisms for the causes of these things. Of course, this isn't just a comprehension phenomenon, it also appears as production. We've known forever that people produce these agreement attraction errors in some portion of cases. That was Trollope's observation. But now we know that attraction is happening even in cases where the speaker ultimately says the right thing. So Maggie Candell, she discovered a simple paradigm for eliciting sentences involved in describing these aliens. It's actually a very good way of getting people to say the same thing. So people will say things like, the pinky above the greenies are miming. And yeah, sometimes people get it wrong, but looking at the timing of people's speech, what you can also see is when people get it right, which is most of the time, you can see in the timing that they're experiencing the same conflict and they slow down. So it's happening all the time. Importantly, we also see cases of immunity to attraction. If people were just remembering complex noun phrases incorrectly, then they should make similar mistakes whenever they need to form a relationship with that noun phrase, such as when they're trying to form a relationship to get the form of a reflexive pronoun like herself or themselves right. But they don't. Patrick Sturt, who is somewhere in the room here today, he's come down from Edinburgh for this. Patrick is my scientific twin. You have to ask me after what it means to have a scientific twin, but you should be lucky to have one. Patrick showed an important study from 20 years ago that this doesn't actually throw people off in the way that it does for subject-verb agreement, and Brian Dillon subsequently showed it in a nice side-by-side comparison. And the same thing is true in a production version of this that Maggie Candell showed, it's just quite robust. You're very fragile with subject-verb agreement, very infragile with reflexive subject agreement. But things get even more interesting when we turn away from English. Well, I think it gets more interesting, so this is where you have to buckle up a little bit. So here we're going to do some Russian morphology, which is very exciting for some people in the room. Natalia Slusar showed a remarkable case involving what I would call ghost plurals in Russian. So in Russian, as in many other languages, prepositions tell you about the case of the noun that follows them. So na, which is like English to, wants an accusative noun, whereas glia, which is like for, wants a genitive noun. And meanwhile, the noun forms for different case number combinations happen to coincide. That's where things get fun. So that the genitive singular form stati, this is a singular, has the same form as a nominative plural. And that thing which is not even plural, but looks like one, that causes plural errors in Russians. In contrast, the genitive plural, which is really plural, but it doesn't look like the nominative plural, doesn't faze Russians as well. So this may be like putting some of you to sleep, but I find this super exciting. And because what that shows us is something about what is the information that Russian speakers are tracking as they do this, they are really sensitive to the forms of words. Okay, that matters. They're not distorting like the abstract analysis of this. Still buckled up, because now we get Hindi. And Hindi works differently. So my former student Brian Dillon and his student Sakshi Bhatia have looked at related things in Hindi, and their surface forms really don't matter so much. In Hindi grammar, neither surface form nor the structural position determine which noun controls agreement. It's related to the split ergativity of Hindi. That's another really cool thing, but you'll have to ask a linguist afterward about what that is. And anyway, Bhatia and Dillon show that Hindi speakers show robust agreement attraction effects, both from subjects and objects, but what matters in Hindi is not whether the noun has a form of a plural. Instead, what matters is a much more abstract property, which is the noun one that is itself an agreement controller for some other verb? If it is, then it can disrupt other verbs. And so Hindi speakers, they instead are tracking the abstract properties of what's going on in a different way than Russian. So I wanted to show you some more about Russian, but we won't have time, and this is just going to make your heads explode. So just trust me, we are only scratching the surface here. For some of this is a total party. So why am I so into this? Well, because 15 years ago we had no clue that we'd uncovered this level of richness. We knew about some of these basic errors, that was well known, but we didn't know that when we dug further, we'd find all these detailed ways in which you can turn it on and off. People don't just mess up all over the place, they do so in a highly selective fashion. And this provides details of what information people are encoding, and both how and when they go about accessing it. And more importantly, it reveals regularities in the mental computations that people are engaged in, which vary by language, and which learners cannot directly observe. I cannot see how you're processing the sentences that I say. So if you're all turning out to do it in the same way, in a way which varies in systematic ways based on your language, there's something really cool that led you to do that in the same way. And that's what keeps us excited. Okay. Now, this is not just a phenomenon about agreement attraction. I could show you the same thing about 6 other different types of phenomena, but the same story happens, which is when we initially thought we'd find people just messing up across the board, as we've dug further, what we found is it's extremely fine-grained and we can turn these on and off in all kinds of cool ways. Okay, so this is why I say it's like the 1970s again, but with 2020's precision. Back then, in the 1970s, newly developed explicit models were leading linguists to discover lots of new things that they hadn't discovered before, that they hadn't been aware of before. And at the time, it was happening all at the level of whole sentences, with little consideration of how things happen in time. And nowadays, we have newly developed explicit models at a finer grain of analysis. And what we're discovering, again, like in the 1970s, is a whole set of really rich patterns that we had no idea a few years ago existed. And this, in turn, is giving us lots of new problems to sink our teeth into, just like our forebears from 50 years ago. We've got lots of mid-level generalizations that we want to see if they map onto higher-level generalizations. We've really got a lot of puzzles about how it is that kids converge on this, and it involves, to do this, we have to do a lot of combination of linguistics expertise, plus psychology, experimental expertise, plus a good dash of computational modeling, and that requires a different type of person to be able to do that. And one of the nice things is, 20 years ago, it was hard to find that in linguistics programs, but now there are quite a lot of people that can do that, and that's one of the really interesting things that has happened. Now, that's one piece, okay. Now, how did we get to this point, and why do I really care about this kind of thing? And what have we been up to recently? To explain that, I'm going to need to fill in another piece of the puzzle, and the hot take for this section is that there are interesting problems all around us all the time, if only we're ready to notice them. And sometimes we don't notice them until much later. So in the second part, I want to, right, so here we need to go back into the same picture that we started with. You did a little demo already, but I didn't tell you much about what we were actually up to in that case. So part of what we were doing here was we were trying to get a developmental handle on a contrast that we'd become obsessed with during the pandemic. Something that we'd known for a few years was that in comprehension, some words are less surprising than they ought to be. So-called role reversal sentences are a case in point. We're going to hear a bunch about them now. In a sentence like, the restaurant owner forgot which customer the waitress has served, the verb served is a good continuation, it works just fine. But if you flip the arguments there, so if you get which waitress the customer had served, that should be bad. That doesn't work so well. People definitely notice the error, but if you look at their earliest reactions, they're initially pretty unfazed as if they're not noticing it. Fine, so it looks like they're insensitive, not the only case where we see that. But if we instead have people generate the continuations themselves, then they're actually really good. So they'll say served a lot when they're continuing the first one. They won't say it very often at all when they're continuing the second one, even if we probe them at exactly the same time. Okay, so there seems to be this sharp contrast between comprehension and production, and something we became interested in about 4 years ago, but it was actually uncovered many years earlier by Wingyi Chow, who's also in the room somewhere here. Where are you, Wingyi? There she is, yeah. But we didn't notice the significance at the time. We only discovered what Wingyi discovered many years later. It was irresistible for us to get into this because the comprehension-production contrast speaks to something that I've known we needed to address for years. It's also the kind of surprising conflict that is like catnip to me, and was also a great thing to work on during the pandemic. But to understand that, we need to go back 35 years to follow how I even got into this line of work. So now we get some of the background stories. So this is like the interlude, but okay. Okay, so I mostly grew up about 3 hours from here in Spalding, a small town in the fens of Lincolnshire, and nothing much happens there. To be honest, it's mostly tulips. Well, except back in 1967, which was shortly before I was born, when the Barbecue 67 music festival happened. You'll notice a few acts there that some of the older of you may have heard of. They were up and coming at the time, but the headline act is one you probably haven't heard of. It was not so well known today. It was Gino Washington and the Ram Jam Band. Who's heard of that? Linguists. Okay. Wow, impressive. Gary, yes. Okay. Apparently they had an amazing live show. This is actually relevant to linguistics because the band's founders, one of the band's founders and its keyboard player was Jeff Pullum, who more of you know as Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at the University of Edinburgh. He'd hoped to be here today, but he's not coming to the UK until next week. Some of you actually may know of, who are a little younger, may know of the 1980 #1 hit Gino by Dexys Midnight Runners. But many of you linguists didn't know that was a song about Jeff Pullum's band. And that is cool. And that happened in Spalding. Okay. But, and then it was tulips for a long while. Okay. Anyway, by the early 1980s, I was a kid in a local boys' school. And so this is it. And I clearly remember my maths teacher telling me that I really ought to check out this person called Chomsky. I really had little idea what he was talking about. It's not like I could just go Google him those days, because we didn't have Google. But Mr. Rimmel had a point. I was a kid who was into languages, and I was into maths, and I was also psychology curious, and 10 years later I was Chomsky's teaching assistant. But at that time I had no idea who this Russian-sounding person was that he was talking about. And now another thing that happened at the same time was that my German and Russian teacher, David Jones, he took me on a 6-hour round-trip drive to come to Oxford to go on an open day at Lady Margaret Hall. And I think it was a Modern Languages open day. I was immediately charmed and wanted to come here. And just a couple of weeks ago, I got to lead the linguistics section of the same open day. And together with my colleague Daniel Altschuler, who's here. And I'm also happy to say, I think David is here also. There's David, yes, thank you, David. Yes, David put me here 40 years ago. And so I'm glad he's here with us today. And another person who had a profound influence on me at the time was one of my classmates, Helen Dolby, who I also see there. And it was Helen who pushed me to read and think more intensely than I ever had before. And I'm really happy that Helen was able to come here. So it was an international trip to get here, so she just got in a short while ago. By the following year, I was here in Oxford, starting out as a modern languages student down the street at Worcester College. Also in this picture, so I'm here, but also there's Daniel Waygood and Scott Rockingham, Stephen Bartle, 3 of my cohort mates from 1986. They're all here, they're online in the middle. I'm thrilled that they're here today. But I jettisoned French because I struggled with the French poets, sorry. So that left me doing just German, which meant that I got to pick up various topics that I wouldn't have otherwise covered, especially a lot of medieval literature. I did a little bit of linguistics adjacent work. That was with Chris Wells, who some of you know. I almost made contact with linguistics when I spent a term with Leslie Seifert at Hartford College, then I was studying Martin Luther. This was because Leslie had actually been a key figure in introducing linguistics into the modern languages curriculum in Oxford. But again, I missed that opportunity because I was doing the other thing that Leslie was into. I edged a little bit closer to linguistics through an odd situation involving Somerville. I've been doing tutorials on medieval German with the wonderful Olive Sayce. In those days, we wrote everything by hand, of course. And due to some kind of odd story involving the problem in the mail between Somerville and Worcester, all of the work that I'd written for Chris Wells went missing. And so I had to redo it. And that got me reading some things that were a little bit less adjacent and closer to what we would think of as linguistics. Now that really caught my interest. And and then also, oddly, a summer job teaching the English tense system to French students and having to actually make sense of it got me quite interested in understanding the details of grammatical systems. The big break, though, was another stroke of luck. I ran into somebody on the quad at Worcester College one day who said, so we have these scholarships to go spend a year in the US at the University of Rochester, and nobody has applied. Would you be interested in going? So I went to the bookstore down the street, that's where Waterstones is now, and quickly determined that Rochester was just outside New York City. It's like hundreds of miles. I had no idea what the scale then. So I said, sure, and that's how I headed off for what I thought was going to be a 9-month adventure in the US, and that turned into 33 years. And Rochester was where everything changed for me. I landed there at a time when there was this amazing interdisciplinary group of people studying languages across disciplines. It was linguistics, psychology, computer science, and philosophy, and they were all talking and working closely together. And one of the first teachers I had there was this fiery young Basque woman who had just completed a PhD at MIT just weeks earlier, and who was unlike anything I'd encountered before. She was passionate about finding the truth, and she gave us homework assignments on the structure of Basque, which was wild, I thought. And that person was Isia Laka, and I'm glad that she is here today. And she came over from the Basque country, where just a couple of weeks ago she won this super prestigious award, which you can read about here if your Basque is better than mine, which I'm hoping it is. Rochester was also the first place that I crossed paths with former Somervillian, Janet Dean Fodor, because of a conference on psycholinguistics that I helped to organize. I wasn't particularly into psycholinguistics at the time, but Janet turned out to be a guiding light for me in subsequent years. And also in Rochester was Andrea Zukowski. So that made a big difference too. We've been married for nearly 30 years, and our daughter graduated from college just a couple of weeks ago, and Andrea arrived in the US just yesterday morning, so she also has a pass for falling asleep. So Rochester was where I became a linguist, and where I got my taste of what language science could be, but it was in my 5 years at MIT that it started to turn into a research theme that I could really get into. MIT was a very rich environment in a different way. We were in the old Building 20, where radar had been developed in World War II. The place was falling apart. It wasn't at all like the ultra-cool Frank Gehry building that stands there now, but people loved it there, and absolutely nobody bothered us. We did not have a tourist problem. So a key step for me happened at a point when I was so delinquent on my coursework that I was at risk of going on probation. True story. But I owed a paper in a syntax class for David Kozeski, and I also owed a paper in a psycholinguistics class for Ted Gibson. And I clearly remember waking up in the middle of the night one day, realizing that I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I won't go into the details here, but the key idea was that we might be able to solve some... Oh, where were we? Here we go. Here we are. We might be able to solve some long-standing puzzles about the constituent structure of sentences if we took seriously the idea that we build sentences in a left to right fashion, starting at the beginning and ending at the end. Now, I know this might sound like a little obvious to many of you, but it was actually a bit of a heretical claim. There was a long-standing tradition in linguistics of insisting that when we talked about the process of building sentence structures, we were describing a cognitive system, but we really weren't talking about something that happens as a real-time process. So I got myself off academic probation, also good. But now I was curious to dig further, and so I wanted to find out what was the motivation for the claim that linguists weren't studying real-time processes. What was the basis for assuming that linguists were studying a cognitive system called the grammar that was related to, but distinct from other cognitive systems that were dedicated to particular tasks, like speaking or like understanding, that were mostly being studied by psychologists at the time. As a young faculty member, I turned from being a syntactician with psycholinguistic interests into a psycholinguist with syntactic interests. There's a lot more that could be said about that, but that was how all this work on illusions came about. That's that whole line of work. And by this time I was working at the University of Delaware, where they had a senator that not many people had heard of at the time. And then subsequently for the last quarter century I've been at the University of Maryland, where they like to say that their most famous alumnus is Kermit the Frog. Jim Henson's from my neighborhood there. So there I got to work with a lot of different experimental approaches on a lot of different languages, with increasingly amounts of modeling thrown in for good measure. And I was able to do this thanks to an absolutely amazing line of graduate students. But there was one big piece of the problem that I knew was important, but I didn't really know how to address it. And this was about the relationship between speaking and understanding. All our work on narrowing the gap between grammar and comprehension was of limited value if we couldn't narrow the gap between speaking and understanding. Now, I've known this forever, so I dug out this handout from a talk I gave in 1998, where Janet Fodor, there she is again, invited me up to this thing at CUNY Graduate Center called the Psycholinguistic Supper Club, and it's clear looking through that handout that I was really trying to address this, but I was flailing. I just had no idea how to do this. But we did eventually get there, but it took a while and a bunch of smart people, and surprises that we didn't expect. So if we look at a timeline, so back in 2005 or so, Claire Stroud, she and I started working on how to understand comprehension-production relations. We were going to solve it, but we hit a wall and gave up. So Claire changed directions and went and worked on something completely different instead. That was role reversals. She was the first one to actually start doing that. And there were some really surprising recent effects in the electrophysiology literature about how role reversal sentences, which are structurally fine but semantically weird, seem to elicit the opposite of the electrophysiological response you'd expect. And there were a bunch of people digging into that. Don't need to go into that. A few years later, it was then that Wing-Yi Chow, who's here again, built on Claire's work and eventually persuaded me, after much kicking and screaming, that in fact what was interesting was something else in the electrophysiological findings that people hadn't been actually focusing on so much. And that was that people were actually insensitive, that they were unsurprised by seeing these verbs that didn't fit. And then she and Shota Momma went on to make a really interesting case that what we were actually looking at was failures in people's abilities to use context to make accurate predictions. And as a support for this, they showed that you could actually get people to say the errors themselves if you put them in a speedy close task like we'd already played. What they didn't make much of at the time is that people don't do it that much. And at the same time, Shota was working, we thought independently, making headway on understanding the relationship between speaking and understanding, but that seemed like an entirely different project. A little after that, Lara Ehrenhofer tried to build on this. She was focusing on effects of word order and child in adults and children, but what she found was totally different, that she inadvertently found ways of making grown-ups and children better than we thought they could be, and at the time we had no idea what to make of this, but we have a much better idea now, and Lara's also here. Lara was an Oxford undergraduate in English, then she did an MPhil here in linguistics, working with Aditi Lahiri, before coming to Maryland to do a PhD with me. And Lara's here, having traveled over from Berlin, where she's currently leading an industry AI team. And we're really excited that Lara's tomorrow is going to be doing a session for graduate students on careers in industry for linguists, and so we're really happy that she's going to do that for us. And it's only been in the last couple of years that Masato Nakamura realized that we've been sitting on this comprehension-production contrast in role reversals, and that understanding this was really likely to help us understand the relationship. So he and Rosa Lee and others set to work to make sense of the successes and failures and timing effects and all kinds of other variability that we've seen. And this process was really helped by the pandemic for a couple of reasons. So first, we started having lots of outdoor meetings. We took a lot of walks. We put aside our laptops, and this helped us notice things that we wouldn't have noticed if we were sitting around staring at our laptops all the time. Also, we couldn't bring people into the lab, so we had to move things online. And we thought it would be really hard to use that to study spoken language data, but we found the opposite. Speech experiments can work really well online if you set them up right. And now you could gather data from 80 speakers in Japan while you're asleep in the US, which we couldn't do before. And thanks in particular to Masato and to Maggie Candell, we were able to automate the process of analyzing what people say and when they say it in ways that we just couldn't have imagined a few years earlier, and that was transformative for us. So to give you a sense of what we were able to do, I want to tell you about one neat set of studies that Rosa Lee led. So as a reminder, our starting point was this comprehension-production contrast. If you show people role reversal sentences, they're initially pretty insensitive to the manipulation. They're like not surprised by the bad served. But if you have them produce the continuation, they show clear sensitivity. And so why is it? Why are they contrasting? Well, maybe it's because it's an experimental artifact. In comprehension studies, you show people a lot of weird sentences, so maybe that just insensitizes them. So maybe it's garbage in, garbage out. So in production studies, you're making the continuations yourself, so maybe there's no garbage and you do better. So to get at this, we mix things up. We ask people to start start producing lots of role reversal errors in a study where they are also shown, start producing a lot of role reversal sentences in a study where they're shown a lot of errors. We did this by creating a hybrid paradigm, it's kind of sneaky, where people see the beginning of a sentence and they don't know whether they're going to be shown the continuation or have to produce it for themselves until the last minute. Okay? And so it's only the very last moment that they have to respond. So it's a cool idea, but it didn't make a difference. Even when people are being shown a lot of bad sentences, their productions are still fantastic. So next we went a step further, reasoning that people confront tempting lures only in comprehension tasks, and maybe it's these temptations that are the key. So we added those temptations to a production task in what we call a distractor close paradigm, where we have people produce continuations for themselves, but at the point when people are saying these continuations, we also flashed a word at them. And you could say, if the word is good, you can say it. If it's no good, say something that fits. Okay? We set this up such that sometimes the distractor was a reversal word like served, and sometimes it was a totally unrelated word that it should be easy to ignore, like thrown. We thought that people would really hate us for this task, but they could actually do it. And you can see that here. When people were shown an irrelevant verb, like thrown, they hardly ever said thrown. So that's good. Okay? On those same trials, with the irrelevant distractor like thrown, people's productions were actually pretty much exactly the same as we'd seen in other studies. When served was a good option, they said served. When it was bad option, they didn't say it. Okay? So this is almost identical to the data from the previous experiment I showed you. So it made no difference at all, even though we'd like being really mean to them. Okay, so what happened in the situation where the distractor was the reversal verb, like served itself? Did people then say it? Well, yes, they did, and a lot. So when served was an appropriate continuation, they said it, as they should, it's fine. But when served was a reversal, then they also said it a lot. They couldn't help themselves. So confronting people with a tempting lure dramatically increases the error rate in production. We were able to take normally successful production and make it look more like the insensitivity that you would normally see in comprehension. And we were also able to do the opposite. So once the pandemic was in decline and we were able to bring people back into the lab again, we did another version of the mixed flow study, this time with an electrode cap on people's heads while they're doing the task. And remember, this is the paradigm where you're not quite sure whether you're going to have to say the word or whether you're going to see it. And there, to simplify the story, there we found that when people are in that mixed paradigm, then they became sensitive in comprehension. So we could make their production, which was normally good, bad. We can make their comprehension, which was normally bad, good, and we can flip them back and forth. And so we thought this was really cool because people are basically very good unless you tempt them. We thought that comprehension production, we had a case where it looked like they were really different, but in fact, as we dug further, we found that they had an awful lot in common with each other, which actually supported the idea that we could narrow the gap. Okay, so zooming out again, why do I care? Well, comprehension-production relations were always a key challenge for the main thing that I care about. And that goes back 30 years. But it took a long while to figure out how to concretely tackle this. We've been doing lots of other comprehension production work, but there's no time for that here. Now, one thing that I found interesting about this is that progress came not from advances in measurement technology. Actually, the technology we use now is actually, which includes some pretty fancy technology, we've been doing that for 30 years. What led to the progress was it came from opportunistic discoveries and from also big advances in computational tools for modeling and for analyzing data. But then how do we get to be able to combine the linguistics and the computation and the psychology? And about that picture again that we've seen a couple of times, well, why are we doing outside in a noisy environment? So that takes us on to the penultimate piece, and the pieces are getting shorter. And this one is about how we make it happen. And the hot take for this one is some things that seem like distractions aren't. Okay. So this part is all about institutional context. Interdisciplinary scholarship and training don't happen in a vacuum. And as many of you know, a lot of my time over the last 20 years has been devoted to trying to understand different ways of bringing people together from diverse backgrounds. And this gets us into a nexus between scholarship and public engagement, which I know is important to things that matter to the university. I see the Vice Chancellor nodding here. Also, it's important to what we want to do in the Schwarzman Center, where that's one of the goals for this, our new home next door. So if we go back to my days as an undergraduate student here, I had a great time here. Don't get me wrong. I rather enjoyed spending my days in the Taylor Rand Library down the street from here. It was sometimes exciting, but it was also kind of isolating. And I've been very fortunate to find myself in some very rich environments for interdisciplinary language study subsequent to that. And observing what I've seen, I can pull out some key characteristics. So first, Rochester. There they did a really good job of creating a culture and a community. One of the things that really struck me there is that I could get to know fellow students, and it would take me a while before I could figure out which field they were from. So was it linguistics? Were they psychologists? Were they computer scientists? So one case in point is Massimo Poesio. So Massimo is here somewhere, I think there he is. Massimo, I met him early on. He's a computer scientist, but it took me a while to figure out which field he was from. And that was actually quite an amazing achievement that they had there. At MIT, there was a lot of cross-department contact as well, in a tradition that goes back to the 1960s. But what stood out there was how much it was driven by a clear purpose. Language people from different fields were coming together because they had a clear sense of the problems that they wanted each other's help in solving. And we don't have time for this, but you can see this in the document from 1960 that was proposing the creation of linguistics at MIT. And then the third piece that we worked on a lot at the University of Maryland over the last 10 to 15 years is trying to combine those two ingredients with a third, which is the creation of infrastructure to help support people working together across disciplines. And by infrastructure, I don't mean space, though that's great. Also mean having talented staff with relevant expertise to navigate a complex institution, and also creating mechanisms for students and faculty at all levels to develop skills to be leaders in collaborative efforts. It's super important. And something that we learned in multiple ways is that sometimes things that seem like distractions actually turn out to be extremely useful to our main mission. So the first example of this comes from public engagement efforts. We built this up starting around 15 years ago. We brought high school students to the university. We took part in science fairs and community fairs. We had grad students present at careers fairs where they could sell the idea that you could do language and you could do science and they weren't in conflict, which many students didn't know from high school. We started this for altruistic reasons, but we quickly figured out that they were helping us as much as the people we were trying to help, because it gave us a low-risk way of working together, which helped us lay the foundations for doing higher-risk collaborations subsequent to that. And that was about 8 years ago. About 8 years ago, as we've been building more of a profile in this area, I got a call from a lady who said she was interested in creating a museum about words and reading. This all seemed a little bit far-fetched to me, but I took the call. And it seemed far-fetched because I didn't yet know Anne Friedman. And we got talking, and I told her about how you can come at language from a really wide range of angles. Language diversity, history, human development, neuroscience, literature, music, rhetoric. And Anne was sufficiently taken by this that it turned into the vision for the museum. And a few years later, that museum opened as Planet Word, a wonderfully restored Victorian school building just a few blocks from the White House in Washington, D.C. And if you're ever in Washington, D.C., you should absolutely go and see it. It's amazing. I cried the first time I went there. It's really impressive. And now one other piece that we contributed to this, led by my colleague Charlotte Vaughan, was something called the Language Science Station, which is an effort to bring research onto the museum floor and to show that the museum is part of the process of discovering new knowledge. It's not just static. And to do this, we run a course for undergraduate students from DC area universities, where students learn how to carry out research studies. And crucially, they also learn to talk with the public about the research that they're doing. So teams of researchers work closely with the students to workshop how to make the studies engaging and fun, and how to use this as a springboard for conversations with visitors. And we honestly weren't sure how this would work, but it turned out to be amazing. This was how Race the Robot came about. This is what Rosa was piloting in that picture that you've seen before. We actually run our studies in the hallway outside the bathrooms at Planet Word Museum, because we know you get a lot of traffic there. And it turns out with modern recording technologies, you can actually get great speech timing data even when sitting outside the bathroom with people yelling at a computer. And so that works surprisingly well. And so this is a picture from the last day of the summer course in 2022, and the progress that the students made in 6 weeks was just incredible. And Rosa and I are going to be presenting to that, the third iteration of that course, on Thursday evening from Oxford. And if you want to know about the results, Rosa's giving a talk at the Lingo conference that graduate students here are organizing 2 weeks from now, so you can go along and hear that at Jesus College 2 weeks from now. Sign up. So This was one way in which public engagement activities, which might have looked like they were a distraction from a primary mission, turned out to be anything but a distraction, as well as a lot of fun. And there's another way in which apparent distractions turned out to be anything but, and that's in learning how to build diverse communities. So when it comes to interdisciplinary scholarship, of course, who wouldn't want to be a polymath? But people naturally have concerns about being judged or misunderstood, and it's risky. And the same thing happens when it comes to creating healthy communities. People want to be in shape, of course, but they have concerns about being judged or being too slow or not fitting in somehow. And one of the other things that surprised me over the past 8 years is how working on the second of these problems, mostly as a weekend hobby, actually taught me a whole lot about the first one. And this piece was very much a partnership with Andrea, my wife, this was like our second child. So College Park Parkrun is the local free weekly 5K that takes place next to the University of Maryland. And it needs less explanation in a UK setting than it would need in the US, since it's built on a model that comes from the UK. And we started it in 2016, we've been doing it every week since then. And although not large by UK standards, it turned into the largest event of its kind in North America. We typically see about 200 people a week, very diverse crowd. And the impact on the city university community has been quite deep. It's become one of the main third places in which people come together from all kinds of different backgrounds. That's been very, very, very welcome. Meanwhile, the Maryland Language Science Center was another effort to bring people together from a wide range of backgrounds. It started as an informal community which laid the groundwork for winning some training grants, the success of which then led to the creation of an official university center, and which now has physical space and shared staff, and I'm not running it anymore, which is great. It covers education, and research, and different types of partnership and public engagement. And it brings together a couple of hundred people from around 15 different academic units, ranging from engineering to elementary education. And it also has become a national model for ways of connecting different areas of language. Now, if we look across these two different efforts to bring people together from different backgrounds, it's striking to me how similar are the things that worked in the two cases. In both cases, individuals want to feel seen and valued. In both cases, consistent communication of simple, inclusive values turned out to be crucial. In both cases, the most visible people set the tone. In both cases, a culture of shared ownership and collaboration turns out to be essential. And in both cases, it's social and fun. And you see the same things all over. The motivations are different. In one case, it's physical health and mental health. Although most things are very similar for the academics, the motivations for academics are really diverse and complicated, but you still have to take them very seriously. Now, before moving on, I can't help mentioning 2 points of local connection to this. First, so I actually got my start on putting on inclusive running events back in the 1980s here in Oxford. I squandered more of my second year in Oxford than I care to admit on creating the modern form of the Teddy Hall Relays, which continue to this day. And so I was super excited at the start of last term to take part as a part of a Somerville team, some of whom are here today. And second, I want to give a shout out to the team that has been out in university parks in Oxford every Saturday morning for the last 2 years, similarly working on bringing together hundreds and hundreds of people from across the university and the surrounding community. It's one of the fastest events of its kind in the country, and they're doing an amazing job. And also some of the key people from that are here in the room today also. So, yay. And so now to the final piece, and this one will be short and sweet. So for this it's like, where is it at? Things are happening right here, why I'm excited. So I don't even want to attempt to give an official history of linguistics at Oxford. I would get things wrong, I would forget important people, it just wouldn't go well. So I want to give a more personal angle on this. So I think it's an exciting time to be a language person in Oxford. And it's an exciting time for me to be a language person here. And those aren't exactly the same thing. So objectively, Oxford has been a centre for the study of language for a very long time. At the same time, our faculty is one of the youngest in the university. And there's a lot of current momentum. So back in the 1200s, the first chancellor of the university, Robert Grosseteste, was teaching cutting-edge linguistics and authoring important texts. So the study of linguistics was a key part of the medieval curriculum. It was not too late. The university's first university-funded professorship was the chair in comparative philology, started in 1968 with Max Miller, and the current holder of that post is my colleague Andreas Willi. Did I get that wrong?
1868, not
1860. Oh, I can't read. Yes, 1968. I was 68. That was when I was born. Yes, I'm still thinking about that concert. 1868. Andreas Willi, who is here also. And various steps come over the next 150 years with gradual progress towards creating the faculty and the various degree programs that we have today. And things have come along an awful long way. And I'm especially grateful to the many people whose efforts got us to where we are today. And it's a big deal that over the next year, we're going to be preparing to move under one roof for the next time. And there is the roof that we're moving under. A couple of weeks ago, it was put on top. I don't think it's rainproof yet, so don't move in. Talk to Erin Gordon, she'll tell you all about when that's happening. But a huge amount of other work has gone to get us to this point. And looking forward to the future, we can objectively point to a number of the ingredients that I mentioned before for creating a thriving hub for interdisciplinary scholarship. In terms of infrastructure, clearly next year's move to the Schwarzman Center will be a big deal. In addition to teaching and research, the public engagement opportunities is going to be very, very good for us. In terms of purpose, it's great to know that the university at the highest level has an interest in broadening student experiences to cut across disciplinary and divisional boundaries. And that's the kind of thing that we're very well positioned to tackle in language. And there's more that can be done in identifying areas of shared purpose, and we're going to be discussing that a lot in the months ahead. It's also clear there's a general buzz right now around the way that the community and the culture are developing here. And again, that goes way beyond my remit for today. But one of the reasons why we wanted to bring so many people here today was because of how it could contribute to that. So thank you for being part of that. And in that vein, I want to take a couple of minutes at the end to talk about another piece of the history here that is less well known, but feels very relevant for me individually. So a couple of weeks ago, I had the privilege of giving a talk in Michigan at a memorial workshop for the eminent psycholinguist Janet Dean Fodor, who passed away last year. Janet's name has come up a couple of times already in this talk. She was never one of my official teachers or mentors, but she took a keen interest in me throughout my career. She had very closely related research interests to mine, and she had an uncannily similar background. Like I was just doing the same thing 25 years behind her. And of particular interest to us today, she was also a Somervillian. Yes, and that has been helping me to learn more about how student experiences are similar or different to how they were 60 years ago in Oxford. I learned of the Somerville connection by a video that the Student Linguistics Society shared on YouTube during the pandemic. And it's an interview with then undergraduate Mal Shah, who's now a PhD student at Maryland. Mal is also here somewhere. Where's Mal? Yeah, there's Mal. And it actually turns out very interesting because Mal takes Janet through a tour of her distinguished career, and then at the end, as he's wrapping up and saying, it's been a great honor, blah, 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 we'll turn off the recording, she stops and says, no, I want to tell you about my own student experience here, and how they shaped me. And she talks about how she got to benefit from being surrounded by an amazing group of tutors, and also about how she too was shaped by an unexpected encounter with an American. In her case, it was the legendary psychologist George Miller, who said, I'm sending you off to Chomsky. And that's how it all happened. Now, when I learned about this just before moving to Somerville, I thought, I wonder if there's anything in Somerville's records that could tell me more about this. And so when I got here, I reached out to Sarah Butler, our librarian, and Kate O'Donnell, our archivist, to ask if there was. And there really was. So I'm also grateful to Janet's daughter, Kate Fodor, for giving me permission to share some of the things that I found there. Now, one of my favorite gems in this archive is this little note that's probably from Janet Vaughan, the principal of Somerville at the time. Janet Dean was a philosophy and psychology student. And the note says, Miss Dean loves Miss Anscombe, but she'd rather like a change in philosophy tutor. How about Mr. Strawson? And who are these people? They are like legends of 20th century philosophy. And there's Janet Vaughan said, what are we going to do about this one? Elizabeth Anscombe was one of the people who was closest to Wittgenstein, and Strawson was on his way to becoming a highly influential philosopher of language. And they were in fact part of a remarkable collection of philosophers who were in Oxford at the time and whose students had access to. In particular, these four women, Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Mary Midgley and Iris Murdoch were all associated with Somerville, creating incredible opportunities for the students who were here. And there's a number of really nice recent books about the analytical and linguistic philosophy of the time, when this was the center of the philosophical world. And language was at the center of that. And one thing that becomes really clear from reading about the time is that undergraduate students were probably a little bit closer to the coalface than they are today, because they were a more dominant presence. Graduate education was less developed. There were far fewer postdocs. So undergraduate students had greater access. But another thing that was also equally clear is that the level of individual attention that the students received then was just as high and amazing as it is today. And one thing that I also learned that really surprised me was that Janet Dean's most cited paper ever was something she did as an undergraduate here, working with psychologist Michael Argyle. It's a nice paper about eye contact that turned into a classic in social psychology. It's even cited in modern papers about Zoom fatigue. And cited more than anything Janet ever wrote about psycholinguistics, and no psycholinguist has heard about it. And how likely would it be for something like that as an undergraduate research paper to happen today? Another thing that's in the archive is handwritten correspondence with then principal of Somerville, Dame Janet Vaughan, who Kate O'Donnell tells me was a prodigious correspondent with students. And there are a series of letters written after Janet Dean had gone to the US to do a PhD at MIT. She's missing the UK, and she's looking for ways to come back, and clearly she has an interest in coming back to Oxford. In this particular letter, they're talking about different ways of coming back, and how it would be difficult because there wasn't really linguistics in Oxford at the time. Yeah, she could maybe teach some philosophy, or well, maybe she could pass herself as a psychologist, but if people learned that she was really a linguist, then they'd immediately stop paying attention. So she noted that she'd heard a rumor that linguistics might be starting up here very soon. Very exciting, she says, although I'm sure that won't happen for some time. She understood how things work. So this is from a longer talk that I'm happy to share with people who are interested. But one nice bonus that came from giving that talk a couple of weeks ago was that I learned about Janet's connection to another distinguished Somervillian linguist, Deirdre Wilson. So Deirdre was a student here at Somerville in PPE, in her case, at exactly the same time as Janet. They subsequently both went to MIT at about the same time, and whereas Janet had hoped to return to the UK, but never did, Deirdre came home and had a distinguished career at UCL. So I reached out to Deirdre, and I'm happy to say, I think she's here. Are you here, Deirdre? Yes, welcome, Deirdre, fantastic. As is Leslie Brown, I think, who's another Somervillian from the same time, who's a student overlapping with these guys, and who then remained at Somerville for many years as a much-loved tutor in philosophy. So I'm thrilled that all these people from the Somerville background can be here. And this brings me to the present. So one of the things that I hoped to be able to do was offer more access to research experiences for undergraduates, linking to the kinds of things that have sometimes happened and been transformative for students. It's something that I wish I'd had myself as an undergraduate. As I learned only very recently, it was something that one of my own mentors had access to when she was an undergraduate here in the 1960s. And I wanted to do something about this, but I really wasn't sure how to pull it off. Until my colleague Louise Mycock introduced me to the wonderful Claire Cockcroft, who is the director of the Somerville Skills Hub, who immediately encouraged me to get cracking. And it's been a bit of a hurry, but I'm thrilled that we're about to launch a first pilot of an undergraduate summer research program in a couple of weeks. We have 7 students in the initial cohort from different fields and different colleges, and I think some of them are also here now, and I see a couple of them around. And they're going to be supported by graduate mentors, a mix of people from Maryland and Oxford, and that's one of the main things I'm going to be starting to worry about after we're done with today. So there you have it. I hope now that you understand the picture much better. I hope you have a broader sense of the context that led to this picture. Many of those contexts are here today with us. And I hope you can see why it's an exciting time to be doing language in Oxford and why I feel really fortunate to be a part of it. And I want to end by saying a big thank you to all of you for being here and for your attention. I'm very grateful to many people in LPP, in Somerville, and in the Humanities Division for all the help with today and with getting to this point. I want to give a special shout out to Philomene Probert, who is faculty board chair in LPP, who has become my most recent mentor. and who will hopefully get a very well-earned rest when I take over from her as faculty board chair in a couple of months and she gets out of the way to avoid the shrapnel. But most of all, I'm incredibly grateful to the family who have supported me. That includes my family here in the UK, especially my parents, who waited a long, long time for me to come home. And for my family in the US, especially Andrea, who was willing to find a way to make this work. And we were sitting in the pub a year ago, and she said, "You've got to do this, or you're going to regret it for the rest of your life." So with that, I think we're done. The protocol says you don't get to ask questions, except over drinks outside. But you have name tags. I encourage you to use them. They're there so that you can meet other people you don't already know. So please make use of it, and thank you again. And now we'll do some cap doffing.
Do some clapping first.
Do some clapping, okay.